to welcome us. Mayors, welcome to our nation's capital. But before I begin, I'd like to thank Tom Cochran and his staff for their hard work in organizing this year's meeting. I love Tommy, and I mean that not just because I'm standing behind a podium. I love his passion, and I can tell you that one of the delights of being president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors is working so closely with Tom. Not only is he one of the hardest working people in Washington, he's one of the most passionate. And to have worked here as long as you have and still wake up in the morning and want to fight on behalf of America's cities is just an inspiration. Give him a big hand. We are very fortunate to have him. Now, mayors, back home, I know your inboxes are full. Your phones are ringing off the hook. So I, as much as anyone, feel compelled to thank you for investing the time to come to Washington this week. Now, today, the mayors release our Metro Economies in 2012 report. Hope all of you have a copy. They should be on your tables. The findings, well, they're pretty stark and clear. While D.C. dithers, our metro areas are driving America's recovery. And mayors, Washington needs a wake-up call. You know, there's been a lot of talk about the 99%, and there should be. Washington needed a wake-up call. For too long, issues of social justice and economic equality have been issues that we have raised again and again, and the Congress has sat on the political sidelines. In fact, just a few moments ago when Nancy Pelosi was here, she mentioned our Poverty Work and Opportunity Task Force. Ever since Katrina, mayors have been coming together and say, you got to address this growing gap. Washington needed to wake up and focus on the middle-class families who face piles of past due notices and wonder how they're going to get by. Washington needed to wake up and focus on all those Americans who face the prospect of an American dream that grows more and more elusive every day. And now, as our report shows, it's time for Washington to wake up to the 90%. That's right. 90% of the nation's economic output is produced in our cities. From the downtowns to the suburbs, in our factories, in our offices, in our ports, in our industrial parks, over 85% of the nation's jobs are generated in our metro economies. And the report said something else. If cities are leading this recovery, every one of us knows it's a fragile one. We can't let it slip from our grasp. As the findings show, we had a 1.3% job growth across the country last year. Now, that's not nearly enough to put our people back to work. This year, we expect just 2% growth in GDP, and that's if things fall into place in the way that they could. But there are a whole lot of factors that could interrupt that. What's going on in Europe? What's going on in the Congress today? And so despite the neglect and inaction in Washington, local leaders have been in the trenches getting things done. While Congress has played politics on the debt limit, it was cities like Akron, Ohio, where Mayor Don Pasquale convinced the German auto supplier Reuschling to say, made in the USA. And now, more than 100 new jobs for skilled machine workers are available to Akron residents. And during this football season, while Congress punted on infrastructure jobs, it was in places like Davenport, Iowa, where they created a model downtown jobs program that matches public resources with private dollars to put more people to work. It's a story being replicated from Bellingham to Boston. In my own city, We're making a $4 billion investment at our airport, generating about 40,000 jobs, more than $1 billion investment at our port to compete with the Panama Canal, generating another 20,000 jobs. There's a lot we can do with a partnership, but we need the Congress to do its job. Now, Congress needs to stop starving our economic engine, our metropolitan areas, and immediately make the common sense investments in transportation, infrastructure, and workforce development. We heard from Elizabeth Kautz, our former president, just a few moments ago, a Republican mayor, talking about the need for workforce development. Workforce development, cutting payroll taxes, investing in our roads and our highways. These are things that we've been doing on a bipartisan basis for more than 50 years. We can put people to work by building the foundation that this country needs to compete around the world. You know, earlier today, some of the California mayors were meeting with Secretary LaHood on the issue of high-speed rail. And one of the things I said was, we're debating whether or not we should build high-speed rail in the United States of America 50 years after the Japanese built the Shinkansen, moving more than 2 billion people in that great country. And by the way, not one fatality as a result of an accident. The fact of the matter is, for all of those who say it costs too much, we're going to have to build it one day. Everybody's making investments in high-speed rail. It's going to cost a lot more 20 years from now. But if Congress gives us the tool, we, the nation's mayors, will get it done. We'll put more of our people back to work and get America's economy humming again. That will be our message this week. It's simple. Congress needs to do its job to help us put people back to work. The economic recovery is too slow, and it's a direct result of the inaction of this Congress in 2011. Now, just imagine for a moment if they had taken our advice last June. Imagine if they had invested a small fraction of the $126 billion we're pouring into the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Imagine if we had put 1 million Americans back to work last year, rebuilding our roads, bridges, and our rail here at home, with a proposal that was separate and apart from the surface transportation bill, but would have invested in infrastructure. Now, I can tell you this, we wouldn't be standing here with 340 of our cities fighting to recover from the Great Recession. 80 of our metro areas wouldn't need at least another 5 long years to dig out of this hole. Now, the road to recovery will be longer if Congress keeps on putting up roadblocks. Now, as mayors, we know that the economic downturn has forced government to take and make tough budget decisions. Mayor Nutter has had to cut his workforce. I've cut a fourth of the city's general fund workforce. We've had to almost double from 6% to 11% the amount that people contribute to their pensions for their retiree health. We've had to balance our budget not by passing the buck, but by making the tough decisions. And unfortunately, our local governments are a lot like Rodney Dangerfield. We get no respect. Always at the bottom of the food chain and the wrong end of the stick. When they cut in D.C., when they cut in our state capitals, it's cities like ours that feel the pain. If only it went the other way. If only we could balance our budgets by slashing waste in our state capitals and here in D.C. But we don't have that luxury. We face down the hard budget decisions with drastic drops in revenue. We've struggled to balance our budgets while keeping cops on the beat and picking up the trash on our streets. I didn't hear a loud enough applause for the fact that Mayor Gray and Washington, D.C. have driven down crime and homicides to 1963 levels. I mean, that is amazing. That is amazing after cut after cut after cut. In L.A., some of you know I used to shine shoes at 5 years old. That year was 1958. We haven't been safer than we are today on a per capita basis since 1952, a year before I was born. We need to get this Congress to invest in cop grants. We've had to lay off hardworking employees. We've consolidated departments and closed down others. And while we've been working, we've had to watch the world's best paid debating society in the U.S. Congress. We've had to watch as they use our time, and by the way, our tax dollars, to pursue a campaign strategy of inaction and obstruction designed to defeat President Obama. Now, the American people need an economic strategy right now, not a political one. In the chamber of the House of Representatives, right behind the Speaker's chair, there's a quote by Daniel Webster, one of our country's great legislators and thinkers. It's an inspiring call to action that shows great confidence in America's capacity to do big things. You heard Ariana talking about that capacity a few minutes ago. And he said, "Let us develop the resources of our land, call forth its powers, build up its institutions, promote all its great interests, and see whether we, also in our day and our generation, may not perform something worthy to be remembered." But these days, another quote might be more appropriate. As I watched the Congress this summer and fall, I don't think any of us thought of Daniel Webster. I thought of another great American thinker. I thought of Yogi Berra. With each failure on jobs, it was just like Yogi said, deja vu all over again. What we've seen is a Congress that keeps on making the same mistakes. If we gave the 112th Congress a midterm report card, the grade would be clear. Congress would get an F for failure. Now, I can't say it more clearly, and neither can any of you. Congress has flunked, they've failed, and we, the American people and our cities, can't afford this failure. We can't afford this inaction. We can't afford a Congress where the representatives with the least experience and the most rigid views routinely block good bills and believe that brinksmanship is the only way to negotiate. Some of you know that I was an assembly member, majority whip, majority leader, speaker of the California State Assembly. I remember when we used to value in our legislators, in our leaders, compromise. I remember when we used to value those statespeople, those people that were bigger than themselves and that were willing to focus on solutions. I remember when we worked across the aisle. In fact, one of the first things I did, the first thing I did as Speaker of the California State Assembly with Democrats sitting on one side of the aisle and Republicans on the other, is I sat them together. I gave the Republicans, who were the minority at the time, the ability to name every vice chair for the first time in modern history. I gave them a more proportionality of resources, and we worked together. When I ended, I said, after 6 years, I said, you know, I've learned a lot in the 6 years I've been here. I learned there are Democrats I work with every day I wouldn't invite to my home to dinner. There are Republicans who I never vote with who I would. I learned that people are people. And we need the Congress to start understanding that. We can't afford a Congress where again and again the public interest is sacrificed in the name of brain-dead partisanship. Congress has to be a place where all of our representatives understand that obstruction isn't governance. It's an abdication of responsibility. In fact, it's political malpractice. You know, we've all been watching in horror as this story unfolds of the sinking and sunk Concordia. Imagine a captain abandoning the ship with untold number of people, his passengers, who he's duty-bound to represent and care for. Imagine jumping into that lifeboat before the women and children. Well, that's what these people are doing with the economy. We're trying to right the ship, and they don't care that it's sinking before their very eyes. Now, Congress has to be a place where our representatives appreciate that compromise isn't betrayal. It's the best way for political partisans to work together. Mayor Nutter likes to say, and nobody says it more eloquently, he likes to say when people bump into him on a street or in the neighborhood, nobody asks him about the deficit. Again and again and again, their question is, Mayor Nutter, when are you going to get me a job? I want to get to work. Well, that's the question we have for the Congress. It's got to be a place where Congress takes Webster's words seriously and develops the resources of our land and builds up our institutions. Last June, we made an offer to the country and our leaders here in Washington. We pledged that as mayors, we were willing to lead. We dealt with the devastating effects of the greatest recession in our lifetime. We understood the problems, and we were ready with solutions. I want to remind you, and we all have a copy somewhere, of the common sense jobs agenda that we put together. Now, you all remember what its origins were. We went to Democratic and Republican think tanks, and we said, find me initiatives that over the last 50 years have been supported by Democrats and Republicans alike. Initiatives like infrastructure investment. Initiatives like workforce training that the U.S. Chamber and the AFL-CIO all support. We said, find us initiatives that we can join hands together and present to the Congress to put people back to work. Well, lo and behold, virtually none of those proposals have found any support in the House. But I'll tell you, that's just not good enough. You know, if the first half of the 112th session was a failure, those of us who studied know that you might get a fail or an F on the midterm, and if you work hard and you apply yourself, who knows? You might get a passing grade. And that's why we're here. A lot of people have asked, and they said, well, Mayor, they asked us at the press conference, well, with the abject failure of this Congress, why would you come in the middle of a political season and ask them to do more? And the answer is because that's what the people of our cities want. We pledged that we'd offer practical ideas that would work across the country. But in June, as I said, we also said we can't succeed alone. We need a Congress that was willing to act on jobs. We needed a Congress that was willing to give us support to leverage our local investments with federal funds and put even more people back to work. In June, we were hopeful, the country was hopeful, that Congress would never be foolhardy enough to take the nation to the brink of default. But it was, and it did. This summer and fall, we all hoped that the Super Committee would adopt a new game plan and come to common sense budget agreement that balanced cuts with new revenues. Unfortunately, the Super Committee ended in a super collapse. And now in 2013, we face automatic and mandatory cuts over a 9-year period that will total $1.2 trillion. Cuts that will devastate vital programs that our constituents count on. Cuts that will further hamper our economic recovery. Now, most of all, mayors hoped that Congress would act decisively on the jobs package sent to the Hill by President Obama. But it failed here, too. Congress took the chance to provide a long-term extension of the payroll tax cut. Now, these are people that ran on a campaign of tax cuts and never saw a tax cut they didn't like until the president proposed it. Now, we know that failure has left millions of people who depend on unemployment insurance wondering how soon their benefits will expire. It missed the opportunity to keep thousands of qualified teachers in the classrooms. And it's done nothing to help those who have dropped out of the labor market get the training they need to get back on their feet and qualify for the jobs of the future. All for the sake of political advantage and partisan ideology. Well, I think I speak for all of you when I say it's time to put the country before our party and the people before all else. I know what the pundits say, They say it's an election year and that nothing gets done in an election year. But with 12% unemployment in my hometown, we need to throw out the usual playbook. We need to get things done. And as mayors, we've held up our side of the bargain. And the offer we made in June still stands. It's now time for the Congress to act. As I said, if the Congress flunked the midterm, it can still get a passing grade. When Congress returns to session, it must make a down payment on America's economic future. It must pass a comprehensive long-term jobs bill. We don't need another extension. We need an extension of leadership. We need a bill. We need a bill that puts more money in workers' pockets with a sustained payroll tax cut. A jobs bill that gives businesses, large and small, incentives to hire new workers. A jobs bill that looks to the future and helps American workers get the training and skills they need to compete for the global economy's good-paying jobs. When Congress returns to work, it must stop the threat to the Community Development Block Grant Program. A few minutes ago, you heard Mayor Nutter talk about the foreclosure crisis that's blighted countless neighborhoods, littering them with boarded-up homes. Since 1974, CDBG has been one of the most effective programs for addressing blight like this and revitalizing our communities. But over the last 2 years, Congress has slashed this funding by $1 billion. We can't have the budget axe hanging over our heads. CDBG is a crucial source of funding for cities. Mayor Nutter mentioned earlier today there's a 3-to-1 dividend on the investment. Mayor Smith, a Republican, said when answering the question about don't we need to make cuts, he said there are smart cuts and there are dumb cuts. And I think you couldn't have said it any better. Cuts that hurt investments that produce dividends like housing and economic development are the wrong cuts. It helps working people improve their job skills. It's time to stop the cuts. It's time to restore full funding to CDBG. I mentioned Congress has cut critical public safety programs. For the last 2 years, cops hiring grants have taken a 44% cut. The Burn Justice assistance grants have been slashed by a third. Over the last year, firefighter assistance programs have been trimmed by 16%. In 2012, we need to restore public safety funding. Now, Congress has to get the message. Homeland security begins with hometown security. For the last 7 years, the U.S. Conference of Mayors has promoted consumer financial protection and education. We saw how we got into this economic mess. We got in this mess with derivatives. We got in this mess with predatory lending. And now we need a real ally in the new Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Since its inception, some in Congress have tried to stop the Bureau in its tracks. The time for games are over. We call on the Congress to let the Bureau do its work. The American economy works best when everyone plays by the same rules and consumers have real protection from predatory business practices. It's good for business and it's good for America. And it's the fair and right thing to do. When our representatives get back to their desks, they need to pass the Surface Transportation Bill. We need a long-term transportation funding plan, not short-term stopgaps. The Boxer-Imhoff bill will create millions of good-paying jobs across the country in places like Milford, Ohio, Blairsville, Pennsylvania, and Elizabethtown, Kentucky. It will launch America Fast Forward, which, as you know, 120 of you have signed on to the idea that at a time of high deficits and debt, when we're putting up our own money, they ought to loan us the money to accelerate our programs and put people back to work. 1 million people will get back to work with America Fast Forward alone. So these are the kinds of things that Congress can and should do. It will make critical improvements to our aging transportation infrastructure, Businesses in our city will get their goods to market faster, and our residents will spend less time gritting their teeth in gridlock and spending more time on the things that matter. Mayors, this is the time. Our cities provide the power to the American economy. The Metro Economies report makes that absolutely clear. Our constituents produce the goods and the services that the country and the world depend on. The companies in our industrial parks and our manufacturing centers are creating America's jobs. But for all the hard work going on across the country to get our economy moving again, we haven't seen the same from our leaders and representatives here in D.C. In this political season, we will be heard. We need to demand a vision for our metropolitan areas. We need to ensure their commitment to our cities. And above all, we need action, not talk. We can't wait another year. We can't accept business as usual. And above all, we cannot have another season of abject failure. This is the time. This is our time. The future's in your hands. Thank you so much.